You've found the Stealth Podcast. Where are you watching from? What time is it there? Subscribe and comment to support us. Thanks. Let's begin. What I'm about to tell you still gives me chills, and it happened 3 months ago on Memorial Day weekend. I thought I was just going back to Camp Pendleton to pay my respects and do some quiet reflecting, but I ended up discovering something that shouldn't exist, something that knew I was coming before I even knew it myself. Let me tell you about the night I found my own name carved in stone among the dead. I'm Jake Sanders, 41 years old, and I live in Sacramento now, but my heart's always been tied to Southern California where I served. Been living in my converted Sprinter van for about 2 years since my divorce. Turns out coming back from 3 tours in Afghanistan changes a man in ways that don't fit well with suburban life. My ex-wife Sarah used to say I was always searching for something, and maybe she was right. This Memorial Day weekend, I knew exactly what I was searching for. The drive down from Sacramento to the outskirts of Camp Pendleton took me about 8 hours, but I wasn't in any rush. My buddy Marcus, who I served with, had been on my mind a lot lately. He didn't make it back from our last deployment, and every Memorial Day, I try to visit somewhere that reminds me of our time together. This year felt different though, more urgent, like something was pulling me back to where it all started. I'd done my research and found a decent spot to park for the night just outside the base perimeter, near some old access roads that weren't heavily patrolled anymore. The area used to be part of the active base back in our day, but budget cuts had left whole sections abandoned. Perfect for someone like me who needed to stay under the radar while still being close enough to feel connected to the place. My van set up pretty well for stealth camping, solar panels, blackout curtains, and a quiet ventilation system that doesn't draw attention. I've gotten good at blending in, whether it's Walmart parking lots or remote spots like this. The key is looking like you belong, even when you're technically trespassing. Tonight, I figured any MP who spotted me would understand why a veteran might want to spend Memorial Day near his old base. As the sun started setting over the California hills, I could see the main part of Camp Pendleton in the distance, all lit up and active. But the section I was parked near looked like a ghost town, empty buildings, overgrown roads, and this old observation tower that caught my eye. Something about that tower felt familiar, but I couldn't quite place it. What struck me as odd was seeing an American flag flying at half-mast from its peak, even though the whole area looked abandoned. The first thing that bothered me was how quiet everything was. I mean, I expected it to be peaceful out here, but this was different, like the kind of silence you get right before something bad happens. Even the usual California night sounds seemed muted. I'd parked my van facing the observation tower, and every time I glanced out my window, that flag kept drawing my attention. It was flying perfectly at half-mast, not a wrinkle in it, which was weird because there was definitely a breeze moving the trees around. I tried to settle in for the night, heating up some leftover chili and cracking open a beer, but I couldn't shake this feeling that I was being watched. Combat instincts don't just disappear, you know? Your body remembers how to sense danger even when your mind's trying to relax. I kept finding myself checking the mirrors and peering through the curtains. The tower stood there like a silent sentinel, and I swear that flag wasn't moving at all despite the wind picking up. Around 2,100 hours, old habits die hard with military time. I decided to step outside and get some fresh air. Maybe I was just being paranoid, but something felt off about this whole area. The moment I opened my van door, this overwhelming smell of gun oil and leather hit me. Not unusual smells for someone like me, but I hadn't cleaned any weapons recently, and I definitely didn't have any leather gear with me. It was like walking into an old armory. That's when I noticed the footprints in the dirt around my van. Boot prints, military issue by the look of them, and they weren't mine. They formed a perfect circle around my vehicle, like someone had been doing a security patrol while I was inside. The disturbing part wasn't just that someone had been there. It was that the prints looked fresh, but I hadn't heard a single footstep. These weren't some random hiker's shoes either. These were combat boots, and whoever wore them knew how to move quietly. I grabbed my flashlight and followed the trail of prints, which led straight toward the observation tower. Every instinct I developed overseas was screaming at me to get back in the van and drive away, but I've never been one to run from something just because it felt scary. Besides, if someone was messing with me, I wanted to know who and why. The prints were clear as day in my flashlight beam, and they headed directly for that tower with the motionless flag. The closer I got to the tower, the more everything felt wrong. The air got thick and heavy, like right before a thunderstorm, but the sky was clear. My flashlight started flickering even though I'd just put new batteries in it that morning. Halfway to the tower, I stopped dead in my tracks because I could hear something that made my blood run cold. The sound of boots marching in formation, but there was nobody there. Just empty ground and that eerie rhythm echoing off the abandoned buildings. I'm not ashamed to admit I was scared at this point. I've been in firefights, survived IED explosions, and watched good men die, but this was different. This was the kind of horror that gets under your skin and makes you question everything you think you know about reality. The marching sound got louder as I approached the tower, and now I could make out what sounded like muffled commands being shouted, but the words were just out of reach, like trying to remember a dream. That's when I saw him, a figure in full military dress uniform standing at attention at the base of the tower. Even from 50 yards away, I could tell something was terribly wrong with this soldier. He was too still, too perfect, like a statue that had somehow learned to breathe. My flashlight beam hit him, and I swear the light just seemed to bend around him instead of illuminating him properly. He was raising and lowering the flag in slow, deliberate movements, but the flag itself never seemed to change position. I called out to him, "Hey, you okay over there?" But he didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge that I'd spoken. Instead, he turned toward me with movements that were too smooth, too fluid for a human being. That's when I realized I couldn't see his face. Not because it was dark or shadowed, but because there simply wasn't one there. Just empty space where features should have been, and yet somehow I knew he was looking directly at me with those non-existent eyes. The faceless soldier raised his hand in a perfect military salute, holding it longer than any living person would. The disturbing part wasn't just that he had no face. It was that I recognized the uniform, the posture, even the way he held himself. This was someone I'd served with, someone who should have been impossible to see again. As this realization hit me, the temperature dropped about 20 degrees in seconds, and I could see my breath forming clouds in the suddenly frigid air. I turned and ran. No shame in that. When your brain is screaming that you're in mortal danger, you listen to it. But as I sprinted back toward my van, I could hear the marching sounds multiplying behind me. Not just one set of boots now, but dozens, maybe hundreds, all moving in perfect synchronization. The sound was getting closer, and I could feel them pursuing me even though I was too terrified to look back. My lungs were burning, but I pushed harder than I had since basic training. My van seemed impossibly far away, like I was running through thick mud even though the ground was solid beneath my feet. The marching behind me was so loud now it felt like it was coming from inside my own head. I could hear individual voices calling out names I recognized from guys who didn't make it home. Marcus was among them, clear as day, shouting my name like he used to during morning PT. But Marcus had been dead for 3 years, and hearing his voice nearly made me stumble and fall. I reached my van and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them in the lock. Behind me, the marching had stopped, but somehow that was even more terrifying than the noise had been. Dead silence except for my own ragged breathing and the sound of my heart hammering against my ribs. I managed to get inside and immediately hit the engine start, not caring about stealth anymore. I needed to get the hell out of there before whatever was happening got worse. But the van wouldn't start. The engine turned over fine, but it just wouldn't catch. I tried again and again, flooding it in my panic, while checking my mirrors for any sign of movement outside. That's when I saw them. Dozens of shadowy figures standing in formation around my van, all perfectly still, all saluting in unison. They weren't solid exactly, more like heat mirages, but I could make out military uniforms and equipment. The disturbing thing was that I recognized some of their faces, or what was left of them. Finally, on what felt like the 100th try, the engine roared to life. I slammed it into drive and floored it, not caring about the dirt road or the rocks scraping my undercarriage. In my rearview mirror, I watched the figures fade away like smoke, but that observation tower remained clearly visible, and the flag was still flying at half-mast. I drove for 2 hours straight before I felt safe enough to pull over, and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. I should have kept driving, should have gone straight home to Sacramento and never looked back. But something compelled me to return the next morning in broad daylight. to prove to myself that it had all been some kind of stress-induced hallucination. Maybe it was survivor's guilt, maybe it was just stubborn curiosity, but I had to know what I'd really seen out there. The rational part of my brain insisted there had to be a logical explanation for everything that happened. The observation tower looked different in the daylight. Older, more weathered, but definitely real. The flag was still there, still at half-mast, but now it looked faded and tattered like it had been flying for years. I approached carefully, every nerve on edge, but there were no sounds of marching, no faceless soldiers, just normal daytime quiet. At the base of the tower, I found what I was looking for, a memorial plaque that explained everything and nothing at the same time. The plaque was dedicated to fallen soldiers from various conflicts, with names etched in neat rows. I read through them slowly, recognizing some from my own unit, including Marcus Thompson right there in the middle. These were all guys who died in service, memorialized at this forgotten outpost that nobody visited anymore. But as I reached the bottom of the list, my blood turned to ice. The last name engraved in that dark stone was Jake Sanders, with yesterday's date carved beneath it. I'm writing this from a hospital bed in San Diego. The doctors say I had some kind of massive heart attack while driving back from Camp Pendleton, and I've been unconscious for 3 days. They found my van wrapped around a tree about a mile from that observation tower, but somehow I survived with just some broken ribs and a concussion. The disturbing part is that they keep asking me about my next of kin because apparently my death certificate was filed yesterday, the same date that's now carved on that memorial plaque. I've tried to tell the nurses and doctors about what I saw, but they just smile and nod like I'm having post-traumatic episodes. Maybe I am. Maybe none of it was real, and I just had a breakdown near my old base. But I can't explain how my name got on that plaque, or why the VA has me listed as deceased in their system, or why I keep seeing that faceless soldier saluting me every time I close my eyes. Some honors you just can't escape, even when you're still breathing. I'm still trying to process what happened to me near Joshua Tree last Memorial Day. I thought I was just creating content for my Vanlife channel, maybe getting some cool historical footage for my followers. But when I posted that video at exactly 3 p.m., everything changed. The comments that started pouring in weren't from my usual audience. They were warnings from accounts that shouldn't exist, telling me I'd disturbed something that was meant to stay quiet. And the worst part? When I watched my own footage back, I wasn't alone in those shots like I thought I was. I'm Ashley Lane, 24 years old, and I live in Venice Beach when I'm not on the road in my van. My whole life revolves around creating content for my YouTube channel, Ashley's Van Adventures. I've got about 150,000 subscribers who follow my travels across the country. Most of my videos are pretty standard van life stuff, morning routines, van tours, cooking hacks, that sort of thing. But I'd been wanting to do something different, something that would really set my channel apart from all the other van life creators out there. My best friend and occasional filming partner, Zoe Martinez, had been pushing me to explore more historical locations. She's always been into ghost stories and creepy places, while I'm usually more about the aesthetic and lifestyle content. But my analytics showed that my audience engagement was dropping, and I needed something fresh to keep the algorithm happy. So when Zoe suggested we spend Memorial Day weekend exploring some of the abandoned military sites around California, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to try something new. I'd done my research and found this spot near Joshua Tree that used to be a training ground during World War II. The area was mostly forgotten now, just some concrete foundations and rusted equipment scattered across the desert. It wasn't technically illegal to camp there, but it definitely felt like trespassing on hallowed ground. The plan was simple. Film a respectful tribute video about the soldiers who trained there, maybe catch a cool sunset time-lapse, and post it on Memorial Day for maximum impact. My van's equipped with all the latest gear, multiple cameras, professional lighting, drone equipment, the works. I've invested everything into making this channel successful because traditional jobs just don't appeal to me. There's something about the freedom of the road and the creative control that makes all the long nights editing and the constant pressure to create content worth it. Plus, my followers genuinely seem to care about my journey, which makes the whole thing feel meaningful. Zoe had to bail last minute because of a family emergency, so I was going solo for this trip. Normally, I prefer having someone with me, especially in remote locations, but I'd already committed to the Memorial Day post and my audience was expecting it. Besides, I'd camped alone plenty of times before, and this spot was only about an hour from civilization. I packed extra batteries, brought my satellite communicator for emergencies, and made sure to tell my parents exactly where I'd be camping. The drive from Venice Beach to the Joshua Tree area took about 3 hours, and I filmed most of it for a potential travel vlog. The desert landscape is perfect for the kind of content my audience loves. Wide open spaces, dramatic lighting, that sense of adventure and freedom that van life represents. As I got closer to the historical site, I started feeling this weird energy, like the air itself was charged with something I couldn't quite identify. I arrived at the camping spot around 4 p.m. on Sunday, giving me plenty of time to set up and plan my shots for the Memorial Day video. The area was completely deserted, which was exactly what I wanted for filming. There were these concrete slabs scattered around that used to be building foundations, and you could still see the geometric patterns where military structures once stood. It was haunting and beautiful at the same time, perfect for the respectful tribute content I had planned. Setting up my van for the night, I couldn't shake this feeling that I was being watched. It's probably normal when you're alone in such a remote, historically significant place. Your imagination starts playing tricks on you. But I kept catching movement in my peripheral vision, just shadows shifting between the Joshua trees and abandoned foundations. Every time I turned to look directly, there was nothing there but empty desert and the ghost of what this place used to be. Monday morning started perfectly for filming. The light was incredible, that golden hour glow that makes everything look cinematic. I set up my main camera on a tripod about 20 feet from my van, positioned to capture both me and the historical site in the background. My plan was to film a heartfelt piece about the soldiers who once trained here, then post it at exactly 3 p.m. to maximize Memorial Day engagement. The timing had to be perfect for the algorithm to pick it up. I spent about 2 hours filming different segments, talking about the history of the site and what Memorial Day means to people like me who've never served but want to honor those who did. The whole time I was recording, I had this nagging feeling that something was off. The desert was too quiet. No birds, no insects, not even the usual wind noise you expect out here. It was like the whole area was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Around noon, I started editing the footage on my laptop inside the van. That's when I first noticed something disturbing in the background of my shots. There were these dark shapes that seemed to move independently of the shadows cast by the Joshua trees. At first I thought it might be dust on my lens or some kind of compression artifact, but when I zoomed in, the shapes had an almost human-like quality to them. They appeared to be standing at attention in perfect formation behind me while I was speaking. I convinced myself it was just my imagination or maybe some kind of optical illusion caused by the heat shimmer. Desert environments can play tricks on cameras, especially with all that reflected light bouncing around. But the more I studied the footage, the more convinced I became that these weren't natural phenomena. The shapes moved with purpose, and they seemed to be watching me throughout the entire filming session. It was creepy as hell, but also kind of perfect for Memorial Day content. By 2:30 p.m., I had the video edited and ready to upload. I decided to keep the mysterious background shapes in the footage. They added an eerie authenticity that my audience would probably love. The video was about 8 minutes long, featuring me talking about military history, respect for fallen soldiers, and the spiritual energy of places where people once lived and trained. I'd even managed to work in some subtle horror elements without being disrespectful to the memorial aspect. At exactly 3 p.m., I hit the upload button and shared the video across all my social media platforms. Within minutes, the views started climbing and comments began pouring in. But something was immediately wrong with the response I was getting. Instead of my usual audience of van life enthusiasts and travel lovers, the comments were coming from accounts I'd never seen before. Usernames that looked like random strings of numbers and letters, all posting the exact same types of warnings. "You broke the silence." That phrase kept appearing over and over in the comments, posted by different accounts, but all with the same timestamp down to the second. "Now they'll come. You shouldn't have filmed here." The memorial was meant to stay forgotten. These weren't trolls or spam bots. There was something deliberate and coordinated about these responses that made my skin crawl. And the accounts posting them had no profile pictures, no previous activity, nothing that would indicate they were real people. I tried to respond to some of the comments, asking what they meant and who they were, but my replies seemed to disappear as soon as I posted them. The video's engagement was going crazy, thousands of views in the first hour, which was unusual for my channel, but all the interaction felt wrong somehow. It was like my content had attracted attention from something that wasn't quite human, and now I was dealing with consequences I didn't understand. By 6 p.m., the comments section had become completely unhinged. Hundreds of those mysterious accounts were posting warnings, all variations on the same theme. I disturbed something that should have been left alone. The really disturbing part was that these accounts seemed to know details about my location that I hadn't shared in the video. Comments like, "She's alone at grid reference 224 and the van is parked on sacred ground," made it clear that whoever was posting had either been watching me or knew exactly where I was camping. I decided to film a follow-up video addressing the weird comments, thinking maybe I could turn this into content about internet mysteries or something. But when I set up my camera and started recording, my equipment began malfunctioning in ways I'd never experienced before. The camera would randomly stop recording, the audio would cut out, and my drone refused to connect to the controller. Every piece of technology one relied on for my livelihood was failing simultaneously, which felt like more than just coincidence. That's when I started hearing the sounds. At first, it was just a low humming noise that I assumed was coming from my solar panels or maybe some distant highway traffic. But as the sun began setting, the humming evolved into something that sounded almost like chanting or marching cadences. The kind of rhythmic calls that drill sergeants use to keep troops in formation. It was coming from all around me, echoing off the desert floor and the scattered concrete foundations. I grabbed my handheld camera and started documenting what was happening, thinking this could be incredible content if I could capture it properly. But every time I pointed the camera toward the source of the sounds, the audio would cut out completely. The LCD screen would flicker and show strange interference patterns, like something was actively jamming my equipment. It was becoming clear that whatever was happening here didn't want to be recorded or shared with the outside world. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped dramatically, way more than normal for a desert evening. I could see my breath fogging up inside the van, and frost was actually forming on my windows. This was Southern California in late May. It should have been warm even at night, but it felt like I was suddenly camping in the middle of winter, and my van's heating system couldn't keep up with whatever was causing this supernatural cold snap. The really terrifying moment came when I looked at my phone and saw that my original Memorial Day video was still getting comments, but now they were time-stamped from the future. Comments posted tomorrow and next week were appearing in real time, all from those same mysterious accounts. They were describing things that hadn't happened yet. Day 3, she's still sleeping. Day 5, the van is empty but the cameras keep rolling. Day 7, she understands now why the silence was sacred. I tried to delete the video, but the platform wouldn't let me. Every time I attempted to remove it or make it private, I'd get an error message saying content is currently being archived by Military Historical Preservation Protocol. That made no sense. YouTube doesn't have any such protocol, and I'd never heard of videos being locked for historical reasons. It was like my content had been hijacked by something with administrative access that I couldn't override. Around 10 p.m., I saw them clearly for the first time. Figures in military uniforms standing between the Joshua trees, perfectly still and organized in formation. They weren't translucent or ghostly. They looked solid and real, but something about them felt wrong. Their uniforms were from different eras, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, like they represented decades of soldiers who had trained on this ground. And they were all staring directly at my van with an intensity that made every instinct scream at me to run. I didn't hesitate. The moment I saw those soldiers forming up around my van, I knew I had to get out of there immediately. I threw my essential gear into a backpack, phone, portable charger, water, first aid kit, and prepared to make a run for it on foot. My van was surrounded, and trying to drive through whatever these things were felt like a guaranteed way to end up dead or worse. The nearest main road was about 2 miles away, but I'd rather take my chances hiking through the desert than staying here another minute. But when I tried to open my van door, it wouldn't budge. Not stuck or jammed. It felt like someone was holding it shut from the outside with incredible strength. I could hear scratching and tapping sounds on the metal exterior, like fingernails or maybe military insignia scraping against the paint. The sounds were rhythmic and deliberate, almost like Morse code, but I couldn't decipher what message they might be trying to send. All I knew was that I was trapped inside my own vehicle with things outside that shouldn't exist. I climbed into the driver's seat and tried to start the engine, but nothing happened when I turned the key. All my electrical systems were working, lights, radio, charging ports, but the engine was completely dead. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My phone was recording video automatically, and I couldn't stop it. The recording app had opened by itself and was capturing everything, uploading it in real time to my YouTube channel without my permission. I was being forced to document my own terror for an audience I couldn't see or control. The scratching sounds on my van's exterior got louder and more aggressive. I could feel the whole vehicle rocking slightly, like multiple people were pushing against it from different sides. Through my windows, I could see the soldiers had moved closer, forming a tight perimeter around me. Their faces were becoming clearer now, and what I saw made me wish they'd stayed in the shadows. These weren't living people. Their skin had a waxy, preserved quality, and their eyes reflected light like an animal's would. They'd been dead for decades, but something was keeping them active and aware. My phone started receiving notifications that new videos were being uploaded to my channel, but I wasn't creating any content. When I checked the app, I could see that my channel was live streaming automatically, showing footage from cameras I didn't remember setting up. Multiple angles of my van surrounded by the undead soldiers, along with interior shots of me panicking inside. The viewer count was climbing rapidly, thousands of people watching my terror in real time, and the chat was full of those same mysterious accounts posting cryptic warnings and countdown timers. Around 2 a.m., the activity outside suddenly stopped. The scratching ceased, the rocking ended, and when I looked out my windows, the soldiers had vanished. For a moment, I thought maybe it was over, that whatever had been tormenting me had moved on. But then I realized this was probably my only chance to escape, and I had to take it even if it might be a trap. I managed to get my van door open and immediately started running toward where I remembered the main road being, using my phone's flashlight to navigate. I made it about half a mile before I realized I was being followed. Not by the soldiers this time, but by my own van. I could hear the engine running behind me, headlights cutting through the darkness, but when I turned around to look, there was nobody in the driver's seat. My van was driving itself, following me at exactly my running pace, like it was herding me back toward the campsite. The horror of being chased by my own vehicle, my own home, was almost worse than the supernatural soldiers had been. I veered off the dirt road and tried to lose the van by running between the Joshua trees and rock formations, but it followed me everywhere I went. The terrain should have been impossible for a vehicle to navigate, but my van seemed to float over obstacles and rough ground like it was being controlled by something that didn't obey normal physics. Eventually, exhaustion forced me to stop running, and when I collapsed behind a large boulder, the van parked itself about 20 feet away and just waited. The engine stayed running, headlights pointed directly at my hiding spot, like it knew exactly where I was and was content to wait me out. I don't remember how I got back to the van. One moment I was hiding behind that boulder, exhausted and terrified, and the next moment I was waking up in my bed inside the van as if nothing had happened. It was dawn, birds were singing, and everything looked completely normal. My phone showed that it was Tuesday morning, Memorial Day was over, and according to my apps, I'd had a peaceful night of camping. But I knew something was fundamentally wrong because I could remember every detail of what had happened, even though all evidence suggested it was just a nightmare. My YouTube channel told a different story though. While I'd been unconscious, new videos had been uploaded every few hours throughout the night. The thumbnails showed me sleeping peacefully in my van, with titles like Restful Night Under the Stars and Perfect Desert Camping. But when I watched the footage, I could see things in the background that made my skin crawl. Shadows moving around the van, faces peering through windows, and in several shots, what looked like a figure sitting in my passenger seat watching me sleep. I tried to drive away immediately, but every road I took seemed to lead me back to the same camping spot. The GPS would show me heading toward the highway, but after driving for what felt like hours, I'd find myself parked in the exact same location with no memory of turning around. It was like the area had become a trap, and I was caught in some kind of loop that I couldn't break. My phone's location services confirmed what I feared. I'd never actually left the campsite, despite feeling like I'd been driving for hours. The comments on my new videos were getting more specific and more disturbing. The mysterious accounts were posting detailed information about my daily routine, my thoughts, even things I'd never shared online. She's starting to understand. The memorial chose her. 7 days until she joins the silence. There was something about that 7-day countdown that felt significant, like I was on some kind of schedule that I couldn't control or change. Each day that passed, I felt less like myself and more like I was becoming part of whatever this place was. By Wednesday, I realized I wasn't alone in the van anymore. There was definitely someone or something sharing the space with me, just outside the range of my peripheral vision. I'd catch glimpses of military boots under my dinette table, or see the outline of a figure sitting in my passenger seat when I looked in my mirrors. My channel kept uploading videos showing me going about normal van life activities, cooking, reading, doing yoga, but in every single shot, there was a shadowy companion that I couldn't see with my naked eyes, but was clearly visible on camera. I tried calling for help, but my phone calls wouldn't connect to anyone in the outside world. When I dial my parents or Zoe, the calls would go through, but instead of their voices, I'd hear that same military cadence chanting that had started this whole nightmare. Text messages I sent just disappeared, never showing as delivered. It was like I'd been cut off from the living world entirely, existing only in this pocket of space where the dead soldiers maintained their eternal vigil. On Thursday night, I found a handwritten note in my van that I definitely didn't write. It was in my handwriting, but I had no memory of creating it. The note explained that I'd volunteered to become the new caretaker of this memorial site, that my social media presence would help ensure the fallen soldiers were never forgotten. According to the note, I'd agreed to document their stories for exactly 7 days, after which I'd join them in their eternal watch. The most terrifying part was that as I read it, part of me remembered agreeing to this arrangement, even though I knew I'd never consciously made such a decision. My final video uploaded automatically on Sunday morning, exactly 7 days after my original Memorial Day post. The thumbnail showed an empty campsite with just my van parked alone among the Joshua trees. But if you knew where to look, and apparently my viewers did, you could see me standing in formation with the other soldiers in the background, finally at peace with my role as the digital memorial keeper. My channel continues to post new content every day, sharing the stories of those who served and died, making sure their sacrifice is never forgotten in our connected world. What I'm about to tell you happened to my wife Rachel and me last Memorial Day in the Mojave Desert. We went out there to disconnect from everything. No cell service, no social media, just us and the silence. But the desert wasn't empty like we thought it would be. We found things that shouldn't exist, heard voices from wars that ended decades ago. And when I finally looked at my wife in our van that night, it wasn't her face looking back at me anymore. Some places hold on to their ghosts so tightly that they'll take anyone who gets too close. I'm Ben Torres, 34 years old, and I live in Riverside with my wife Rachel. We've been married for 6 years, and she's probably the only person who can keep up with my need for adventure and solitude. Rachel works as a graphic designer, constantly connected to clients and deadlines, while I'm a freelance photographer who spends way too much time editing photos on my computer. Both of us had been feeling burned out from the constant digital noise, so when Memorial Day weekend approached, we decided to do something radical, go completely off-grid in the Mojave Desert. Rachel is 31 and way more organized than I am. She's the one who researches our camping spots, packs the emergency supplies, and makes sure we don't do anything too stupid when we're exploring remote areas. I'm more of the let's just drive until we find something interesting type, which drives her crazy, but also keeps our relationship exciting. This trip was her idea though. She'd been reading about digital detoxes and thought spending 3 days without any technology might help us reconnect with each other and with nature. We'd borrowed my brother's converted Ford Transit van for the trip since our usual tent camping setup didn't seem adequate for 3 days in the desert. The van had solar panels, a small kitchenette, and enough water storage to keep us comfortable while we disappeared from civilization. Neither of us had much experience with van life, but it seemed like the perfect opportunity to try something new and challenging together. Our plan was simple: drive into the Mojave until we found a spot that felt completely isolated, then spend Memorial Day weekend hiking, stargazing, and just being present with each other. No phones, no cameras, no distractions from the outside world. Rachel had made me promise to leave all my photography gear at home, which was harder than I'd expected, but felt necessary for the kind of reset we were both craving. The drive from Riverside to the Mojave took about 2 hours, and we spent most of it talking about work stress and making plans for the future. Rachel had been considering starting her own design studio, and I'd been thinking about switching from commercial photography to something more artistic and meaningful. There was something about heading into the vast emptiness of the desert that made everything seem possible, like we were driving toward a fresh start. We'd done our research and found what looked like a perfect spot on satellite maps, a flat area surrounded by Joshua trees and rock formations, far enough from any roads or trails that we'd have complete privacy. The coordinates were stored in our GPS, but once we got there, the plan was to turn off all our devices and just exist in the moment. It felt like exactly what our relationship needed after months of being too busy to really connect with each other. By the time we reached our camping spot around 4 p.m. on Sunday, the landscape was everything we'd hoped for. Miles of open desert in every direction, mountains on the horizon, and that incredible silence that only comes from being truly isolated from civilization. The van looked tiny against the vastness of the Mojave, which made us feel both insignificant and completely free at the same time. Setting up camp was surprisingly peaceful. We worked together to level the van, set up our outdoor chairs, and organize our supplies without any of the usual stress or bickering that sometimes happens when we're trying new things. Rachel seemed more relaxed than I'd seen her in months, and I could feel my own anxiety about work and deadlines melting away with each hour we spent away from screens and notifications. The first night passed perfectly. We cooked dinner over a small camp stove, watched the most incredible sunset either of us had ever seen, and spent hours just talking under stars that seemed impossibly bright without any light pollution. I'd forgotten how much I enjoyed Rachel's company when we weren't both distracted by work or social media. We went to sleep around 11 p.m. feeling more connected than we had in years, completely satisfied with our decision to disconnect from the digital world. Monday morning started beautifully too. We hiked for a few hours, exploring the rock formations and Joshua tree groves around our campsite. Rachel found some interesting mineral formations that she wanted to sketch in her notebook, while I practiced just observing the landscape without feeling the need to photograph everything I saw. It was challenging at first, but gradually I started noticing details and colors that I would have missed if I'd been focused on getting the perfect shot. Around noon, we decided to explore further from the van and ended up hiking toward what looked like a series of low hills about 2 miles away. The terrain was more challenging than we'd expected, with loose rock and hidden gullies that made walking treacherous. But the exercise felt good, and we were both enjoying the physical challenge of navigating the desert landscape without any trails or markers to guide us. That's when we first noticed something odd. As we climbed higher, Rachel pointed out what looked like geometric patterns in the sand below us, straight lines and perfect rectangles that definitely weren't natural formations. From our elevated position, we could see that these patterns extended for acres, like the foundation outlines of buildings that had been demolished and buried by decades of sand and wind. It reminded me of aerial photographs I'd seen of archaeological sites, but we weren't aware of any historical significance to this area. The patterns made us both curious enough to change our hiking plans and investigate. As we got closer to ground level, the geometric shapes became even more obvious. Concrete foundations, rusted metal stakes, and what looked like the remains of a road system that had been abandoned for decades. Rachel found a corroded metal sign that was too weathered to read, but the mounting hardware looked military in design and construction. By mid-afternoon, we'd uncovered enough evidence to convince us that this area had once been some kind of military installation. There were concrete pads that could have supported large equipment, underground bunkers that were now mostly filled with sand, and scattered debris that included everything from tent stakes to pieces of communication equipment. The site felt significant, but also forgotten, like something that had been deliberately abandoned and left to disappear into the desert. The discovery changed the whole mood of our trip. What had started as a peaceful retreat into nature now felt like we were trespassing on sacred ground or disturbing something that was meant to stay buried. Rachel suggested we pack up and find a different camping spot, but we were already set up for the night, and the nearest alternative location was hours away. We decided to stay but agreed to be respectful of whatever history this place represented. As evening approached, we both started feeling unsettled in ways we couldn't quite explain. The desert silence that had seemed so peaceful the night before now felt oppressive, like we were being watched by invisible observers. Every sound, wind through the Joshua trees, settling rocks, distant coyote calls, seemed amplified and somehow threatening. We found ourselves speaking in whispers without really knowing why, as if raising our voices might disturb something that was better left sleeping. Around 9 p.m., while we were cleaning up after dinner, Rachel grabbed my arm and pointed toward a spot about 200 yards from our van. There was definitely a campfire burning out there, orange flames flickering against the darkness, clearly visible even though we hadn't seen anyone else in the area all day. The fire wasn't there when the sun went down, but now it was burning steadily, as if someone had just lit it moments before we noticed. We stood there staring at the flames for several minutes, trying to decide what to do. There was obviously someone else camping nearby, but we hadn't heard any vehicles or voices or any sign of other people. The fire seemed to be burning in the exact center of one of those concrete foundation pads we discovered earlier, which struck both of us as strange. Who would choose to build their campfire on concrete instead of in a proper fire ring or cleared area? I wanted to walk over and introduce ourselves, thinking maybe we could share stories with fellow desert campers, but Rachel had a bad feeling about the whole situation. She pointed out that we hadn't seen any other tire tracks or footprints in the sand, and there was no tent or vehicle visible near the fire, just flames burning alone in the darkness, which didn't make sense for normal camping behavior. As we watched, trying to decide whether to investigate or mind our own business, I started seeing things in the fire that couldn't possibly be there. The flames would flicker and shift, and for brief moments, I could swear I was seeing scenes from a battlefield. Explosions, soldiers running, tracer rounds lighting up the night sky. It was like watching a war movie projected onto the campfire, but the images were too vivid and detailed to be hallucinations or tricks of light. Rachel didn't see the battlefield visions, but she was having her own disturbing experience. She kept insisting she could hear voices coming from the direction of the fire. Military radio chatter, orders being shouted, equipment beeping and crackling like communication gear. But when I listened carefully, all I could hear was the normal desert night sounds. We were both experiencing something supernatural, but in completely different ways. The really unsettling part was the equipment scattered around the mysterious campfire. As our eyes adjusted to the darkness, we could make out what looked like military gear, backpacks, helmets, weapons, and communication equipment arranged in neat rows like a supply depot. But everything looked old-fashioned, like equipment from World War II or Korea rather than modern military gear. It was as if someone had set up a museum display in the middle of the desert. Around 10:30, I made the decision to approach the fire despite Rachel's objections. I needed to understand what we were dealing with, and sitting in our van speculating wasn't going to give us any answers. I grabbed a flashlight and started walking toward the flames, calling out to announce my presence in case there really was someone camped there. But with each step I took, the visions in the fire became more intense and disturbing. By the time I got within 50 feet of the campfire, I could barely tell the difference between what was real and what I was seeing in the flames. The battlefield visions had expanded beyond the fire itself. Now I was seeing entire combat scenes playing out across the desert landscape. Soldiers advancing through the Joshua trees, explosions erupting from the rocky outcroppings, aircraft strafing runs cutting across the star-filled sky. It was like the whole area had become a window into military conflicts from decades past. I turned and ran back toward the van when the visions became too intense to handle. What I was seeing felt completely real. The heat from explosions, the smell of gunpowder, the sound of bullets whining past my head. My rational mind knew it couldn't be happening, but my body was responding as if I was actually in combat. I dove behind rocks that weren't there, ducked from aircraft that existed only in my vision, and sprinted towards safety that might not be real either. Rachel was already in the van with the engine running when I reached her. She looked terrified and kept saying that the radio voices had gotten louder and more urgent, like multiple military units were trying to coordinate some kind of emergency response. But our van didn't have a radio system, and there was no cell service for miles in any direction. Whatever she was hearing was coming from the same supernatural source as my battlefield visions. We decided to leave immediately, even though it meant driving desert roads in complete darkness without GPS or proper navigation tools. The alternative, staying near that campfire and whatever was generating these hallucinations, felt far more dangerous than trying to find our way back to civilization in the dark. Rachel kept the headlights on high beam while I tried to navigate using the stars and our memory of the route we'd taken to get here. But something was wrong with our escape attempt. No matter which direction we drove, we kept ending up back at the same campsite. The odometer showed that we'd traveled for miles, the gas gauge was dropping, and we were definitely moving across new terrain. But somehow we always returned to our original parking spot, with that mysterious campfire still burning in the distance. It was like the desert had become a maze with only one destination. After the third failed escape attempt, we realized we were trapped by something beyond our understanding. Rachel was crying now, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. The battlefield visions were getting stronger and more frequent, sometimes lasting for minutes at a time, while the radio voices Rachel was hearing had become a constant background chatter of military communications from conflicts that ended decades ago. Around 2 a.m., we made the decision to barricade ourselves in the van and wait for sunrise, hoping that whatever was happening would be weaker during daylight hours. We locked all the doors, covered the windows with sleeping bags, and huddled together in the back of the van while the supernatural activity continued around us. The campfire was still visible through gaps in our makeshift window coverings, and both of us could feel something circling our vehicle like a predator. Rachel fell asleep around 4 a.m., exhausted from hours of terror and stress. I stayed awake, watching over her and monitoring the situation outside through small gaps in our window covers. The battlefield visions had finally stopped, but I could still see figures moving around that distant campfire, silhouettes that looked like soldiers but moved in ways that didn't seem quite human. They appeared to be setting up some kind of perimeter or patrol pattern around our van. Just before dawn, I must have dozed off despite my efforts to stay alert. When I woke up, sunlight was streaming through the windows, and everything looked normal again. The mysterious campfire was gone, there was no sign of military equipment, and the desert looked exactly like it had when we first arrived. But when I turned to check on Rachel, my blood turned to ice at what I saw lying next to me in the van. The person lying in Rachel's sleeping bag wasn't my wife. It was a man in a military uniform from what looked like the 1940s, and he was smiling at me with a face that was covered in fresh blood. His eyes were Rachel's eyes. I'd know them anywhere, but everything else about him was wrong. The uniform was torn and stained. There were bullet holes in the fabric, and when he spoke, it was with Rachel's voice asking me why I looked so scared. I scrambled out of the sleeping bag and pressed myself against the van's far wall, trying to understand what I was seeing. The soldier kept talking in Rachel's voice, asking me to come back to bed, telling me that everything was fine and we could continue our camping trip as planned. But blood was dripping from wounds I could see on his neck and chest, and his smile never wavered even when he was speaking. It was like Rachel's consciousness had been trapped inside this dead soldier's body. When I demanded to know what had happened to my real wife, the thing wearing her voice laughed and said she'd volunteered to serve, just like all the others who'd camped in this area over the decades. According to him, the military installation we'd discovered had been a training ground where soldiers prepared for overseas deployment, and many of them had died in the wars they trained for. Now they were always recruiting new personnel to join their eternal mission. I tried to run, but found that the van doors wouldn't open. Not locked or stuck. They simply wouldn't respond to any amount of force I could apply. The windows wouldn't break either, even when I hit them with everything I could find. I was trapped in this confined space with something that wore my wife's consciousness like a uniform, and it was becoming clear that escape wasn't going to be possible through normal means. The soldier explained that Rachel had been chosen because of her design skills. Apparently, the dead soldiers needed someone who could help them organize and plan their eternal patrol duties. She was perfectly safe, he assured me, just serving her country in a different capacity than she'd expected when we decided to go camping. Her body was being put to good use by someone who'd earned the right to live again, and I should be proud of her service and sacrifice. Around noon, I finally managed to break out of the van by kicking through a weakened section of the floor. But when I looked back at the vehicle, I could see both Rachel and the bloody soldier sitting inside, occupying the same space, but somehow distinct from each other. She was trying to mouth words to me through the window, but the soldier was speaking over her, using her voice to tell me that I needed to decide whether I wanted to join them or spend eternity trying to find my way out of the desert alone. I chose to run, and I've been running ever since. It took me 3 days to reach a highway, another day to flag down help, and a week to convince anyone that my story was real. The search teams never found our van or any trace of Rachel, and the coordinates I gave them led to empty desert with no signs of recent camping activity. According to official records, there was never a military installation in that area, and Rachel Torres was never reported missing because she's apparently still posting on social media like nothing happened. I know she's still out there, trapped in that desert with soldiers who died decades ago, but refuse to accept that their war is over. Sometimes I get messages from her social media accounts, photos of camping trips I never took, check-ins at locations I've never visited, and captions written in her voice, but describing experiences that belong to someone else. The most recent post was yesterday. A picture of our van parked in the Mojave with the caption, "Ben had to leave early, but I'm staying to finish the mission. Some sacrifices are worth making." The photo shows Rachel smiling next to a man in a bloody military uniform, and they both look perfectly happy with their eternal assignment. I need to tell someone about what happened to me last week, even though I know how crazy it's going to sound. I'm a rideshare driver trying to make ends meet, and I've been sleeping in my van near different spots around LA to save on rent money. I thought I'd found the perfect place, quiet, safe, out of the way. But that cemetery near Riverside turned out to be anything but peaceful. Every morning at exactly the same times, I'd hear this bugle playing like it was Memorial Day or a military funeral, except there was never anyone there to play it. And with each note, something got closer to my van. When I finally captured it on video, what I heard back wasn't just music, it was a warning that knew my name. I'm Troy Walker, 34 years old, and I live in my 2018 Honda Pilot, because living in Los Angeles on a rideshare driver's income is basically impossible these days. Used to have an apartment in Van Nuys, but after my hours got cut and gas prices went through the roof, I couldn't keep up with rent that had doubled in 2 years. So I converted my SUV into a basic mobile living setup. Mattress in the back, cooler for food, portable battery for charging my devices. It's not glamorous, but it beats being homeless or moving back in with family. I've been doing this van life thing for about 8 months now, rotating between different parking spots around the city to avoid drawing attention from cops or property owners. The key is finding places that are quiet, safe, and where nobody's going to bother you for sleeping in your vehicle. I've got about 15 regular spots that I cycle through, 24-hour gyms for showers, libraries for Wi-Fi, and various parking areas for overnight stays. It's a system that works as long as you're careful and respectful. My friend Carlos, who also drives for the same rideshare company, told me about this spot near a cemetery in Riverside County that was perfect for stealth camping. According to him, it was completely legal to park on the street there, the neighborhood was safe, and the cemetery meant there wouldn't be much traffic or noise at night. Plus, it was close enough to the airport and downtown areas that I could still get decent ride requests during peak hours. I'd been looking for new spots because some of my regular locations had become too crowded with other people living in vehicles, and I didn't want to be part of a visible homeless encampment that might attract negative attention. The cemetery location sounded ideal, respectful, quiet, and practical for someone in my situation. Carlos had been parking there for a few weeks without any problems, so I decided to check it out for myself. The drive from my usual area in LA to the Riverside Cemetery took about an hour and a half, depending on traffic. I planned to use it as a base for a few days, while working the morning airport rush and evening entertainment district crowds. The area looked perfect when I first arrived, tree-lined streets, well-maintained properties, and the kind of peaceful atmosphere that would let me get quality sleep between driving shifts. I work weird hours because that's when rideshare pays best. Early morning airport runs starting around 4 a.m., then evening bar and restaurant pickups that can go until 2 a.m. Having a quiet, safe place to sleep during the middle of the day is crucial for maintaining the energy and alertness needed to drive safely. The cemetery spot seemed like it would provide exactly the kind of environment I needed to make this lifestyle sustainable. My vehicle is set up efficiently for someone who basically lives on the road. I've got blackout window covers for privacy and sleep quality, a small camping stove for basic meals, and enough battery power to keep my phone and GPS charged throughout my work shifts. Everything I own fits in the back of the SUV, and I've gotten pretty good at the logistics of urban camping without bothering anyone or breaking any laws. The first thing I noticed about the cemetery area was how quiet it was, even during the day. No through traffic, no construction noise, just the kind of peaceful silence that's almost impossible to find in the greater LA area. The street I parked on had several other vehicles, so my SUV didn't stand out as unusual or suspicious. It felt like I'd finally found a spot where I could establish a routine and maybe start saving some money again. My first night near the cemetery was exactly what I'd hoped for, completely peaceful and undisturbed. I'd finished my evening shift around 1:30 a.m., drove to the spot, and was asleep by 2:15. Woke up naturally around 3:30 a.m., feeling more rested than I had in weeks, got ready for my morning airport shift, and made decent money on the early runs. The location was perfect for my schedule because I could sleep during the afternoon lull and be ready for the evening rush. The second night was when I first heard the bugle. It started at exactly 5 a.m., a clear, haunting melody that sounded like taps or some other military ceremony song. At first, I assumed it was coming from the cemetery itself, maybe an automated memorial system or groundskeepers playing recorded music for Memorial Day observances. But when I looked out my windows, I couldn't see anyone or any speakers that might be producing the sound. The bugle call lasted about 2 minutes and then stopped abruptly, leaving the area in complete silence again. I was tired enough that I just rolled over and went back to sleep, figuring it was some kind of cemetery tradition that I wasn't familiar with. Lots of military veterans are buried in places like this, so memorial music wouldn't be unusual. It was actually kind of comforting in a way, like sleeping near a place that honored people who'd served their country. But then it happened again at 6 a.m. The exact same melody, same duration, same volume. And again at 7 a.m., 8 a.m., and 9 a.m. By the time I was fully awake and paying attention, I realized this wasn't some random cemetery maintenance routine. This was a precise schedule, like someone was performing military honors every hour on the hour. The timing was too exact, and the music too consistent to be anything casual or automated. I started my morning work shift feeling curious, but not particularly concerned about the bugle calls. Drove a few airport runs, grabbed coffee and breakfast, and made good money during the morning rush. The cemetery area continued to seem like a perfect base of operations. Convenient location, safe parking, and the kind of quiet environment that helped me stay focused and alert while driving. The hourly bugle music was just an unusual quirk of the neighborhood. It was during my afternoon rest period that I started to notice other weird details about the area. While lying in my SUV trying to nap, I realized that the bugle calls weren't coming from inside the cemetery itself. The sound seemed to originate from different directions each time, sometimes from across the street, sometimes from behind me, sometimes from areas where there definitely weren't any buildings or equipment that could produce music. Around 2 p.m., I decided to investigate during one of the hourly bugle calls. I stepped out of my vehicle and tried to pinpoint exactly where the sound was coming from. But the music seemed to surround me completely, like it was being played from multiple locations simultaneously. And when I walked toward what I thought was the source, the sound would shift and seem to come from somewhere else entirely. It was disorienting and impossible to track. That evening, I mentioned the bugle situation to Carlos when we met up for coffee between our shifts. He looked at me strangely and said he'd never heard any music during his time parking in that area. According to him, the nights were always completely quiet, which was one of the reasons he'd recommended the spot to me. He seemed genuinely confused when I described the hourly military melodies, like I was talking about something that couldn't possibly be happening. The third night was when everything changed from curious to terrifying. The bugle started at 5 a.m. as usual, but this time I was wide awake and watching through my windows. As the first notes began to play, I saw a figure walking slowly across the cemetery grounds toward my SUV. At first, it looked like a groundskeeper or security guard making routine rounds, but something about the way they moved seemed off, too deliberate, too focused on my specific location. By the time the bugle call ended at 5:02 a.m., The figure had reached the cemetery fence directly across from where I was parked. It was definitely a person in what looked like a military dress uniform, standing at perfect attention and facing my vehicle. Even in the pre-dawn darkness, I could see that their posture was unnaturally rigid, like a statue rather than a living person. They stood there motionless until exactly 6 a.m., when the bugle started again and they began walking closer. At 6 a.m., another figure appeared from a different direction, also in military uniform, also moving with that same eerie precision toward my SUV. Now there were two of them, positioned on either side of my vehicle, both standing at attention while the bugle played. I tried to convince myself that this was some kind of memorial honor guard performing cemetery duties, but honor guards don't usually focus their attention on random people sleeping in parked cars. With each hourly bugle call, more figures appeared. By 7 a.m., there were 4 of them forming a loose perimeter around my SUV. By 8 a.m., there were at least 8, and they'd moved closer to the street where I was parked. All of them in perfect military dress uniforms, all standing at attention during the music, all facing directly toward me. Their precision and coordination would have been impressive if it wasn't so absolutely terrifying. I tried to start my SUV and leave during the 9 a.m. bugle call, but my engine wouldn't turn over. Not dead battery or mechanical failure. The electrical systems were working fine. The starter was engaging, but the engine just wouldn't catch and run. Meanwhile, the uniformed figures had moved even closer, now standing just a few feet from my vehicle on all sides. I could see their faces clearly through my windows, and what I saw made my blood run cold. These weren't living people. Their skin had a waxy, preserved quality, and their eyes reflected light like an animal's would. Some of them had visible wounds, bullet holes, burns, missing limbs, but they stood at attention as if nothing was wrong. They were looking directly at me through my windows with expressions that weren't quite human anymore. Dead soldiers, somehow still performing their duties decades after whatever had killed them. Around 10 a.m., I realized that my GPS wasn't working properly. Instead of showing my location on the street near the cemetery, it just displayed a single dot in an empty white space with the words, "You are here," beneath it. No roads, no landmarks, no indication of how to navigate away from this spot. It was like my SUV had been transported to some location that didn't exist on any map, even though I could still see the cemetery and neighborhood around me. I tried calling Carlos for help, but my phone showed no signal despite being in an area that normally had excellent coverage. Text messages wouldn't send, emergency calls wouldn't connect, and even my rideshare app couldn't establish a connection to their servers. I was completely cut off from the outside world while being surrounded by increasingly numerous dead soldiers who seemed very interested in my presence in their territory. At 11 a.m., when the bugle started playing again and even more figures appeared, I made the decision to record everything on my phone. If I was going to die or disappear, at least there would be some evidence of what had happened to me. I held my phone up to the window and captured video of the uniformed figures standing around my SUV, their unnatural stillness, and the bugle music that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The moment I started recording, their behavior changed dramatically. The figures turned their attention from passive observation to active menace, moving closer to my SUV and beginning to circle it in formation. Some of them started reaching toward my windows with hands that looked more like claws, while others began what looked like military hand signals to coordinate some kind of assault on my vehicle. I tried everything I could think of to get the engine started, different key positions, pumping the gas pedal, even getting out and checking under the hood for obvious problems. But every time I stepped outside, the uniformed figures would close in around me, forcing me to retreat back into the SUV. They didn't touch me or speak, but their presence was so threatening that I couldn't stay outside for more than a few seconds at a time. Around noon, I noticed that my phone was recording automatically even when I wasn't actively using the camera app. The video file was growing larger by the minute, capturing audio and visual data without my input. When I tried to stop the recording, the app wouldn't respond to my commands. It was like my phone had been hijacked by something that wanted to document whatever was happening to me in this place. The really terrifying discovery came when I tried to review the footage I'd captured. Playing back the video showed my SUV surrounded by empty space. No uniformed figures, no cemetery, just my vehicle sitting alone in what looked like an endless white void. But the audio track contained the bugle music clearly, along with sounds I definitely hadn't heard while recording. Marching footsteps, military commands, and voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize. By 1 p.m., I was desperate enough to try abandoning my SUV and running for help on foot. But when I opened the door and stepped outside, I realized that the familiar neighborhood had disappeared completely. Instead of the tree-lined street and cemetery, I was surrounded by white emptiness that stretched to the horizon in every direction. My SUV was the only solid object visible in this void, and the uniformed figures were still there, but now they looked more solid and threatening than ever. I ran anyway, sprinting away from the SUV in what I hoped was the direction of the main road. But no matter how far or how fast I ran, the white landscape never changed, and when I looked back, my SUV was always the same distance away. It was like running on a treadmill, lots of effort and motion, but no actual progress toward escape. The uniformed figures watched my attempts with what looked like amusement, occasionally saluting in my direction. After what felt like hours of futile running, I collapsed from exhaustion and found myself back at my SUV without any memory of walking or crawling back to it. The sun was setting in the white void, which didn't make any logical sense, and the bugle calls had stopped. The uniformed figures were still there, but now they were arranged in perfect formation like they were preparing for some kind of ceremony. I realized I was about to become part of whatever memorial service they had planned. At exactly 6 p.m., the formation of uniformed figures began marching away from my SUV in perfect synchronization, disappearing into the white void one by one until I was alone again. The moment the last figure vanished, my SUV's engine started immediately. My GPS showed normal roads and landmarks, and my phone regained full signal strength. It was like someone had flipped a switch and returned me to the normal world, but I knew that what I'd experienced was absolutely real. I drove straight back to LA without stopping, too shaken to think about working any more shifts that day. The whole experience felt like a warning, like I'd been allowed to leave this time, but only because I'd learned something important about respecting boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. The cemetery area looked completely normal in my rearview mirror, just a peaceful neighborhood where nothing unusual had ever happened. The next day, I met Carlos for coffee and showed him the video I'd recorded on my phone. We watched it together on my laptop, and he confirmed what I'd seen during playback. No uniformed figures visible, just my SUV sitting in what looked like an empty parking lot. But when we listened to the audio track through headphones, both of us could hear the bugle music clearly, along with other sounds that shouldn't have been there. About halfway through the recording, we heard something that made both of us freeze with terror. A clear, authoritative voice speaking directly into the microphone. "Don't sleep here again, Troy." The voice was calm and professional, like a military officer giving orders, but there was an unmistakable threat underlying the words. And I had never spoken my name out loud during the entire recording session. No one in that white void should have known who I was. Carlos turned pale and asked me to delete the video immediately. He said that hearing his name would probably be next if he kept parking in that area, and he didn't want to risk experiencing what I'd gone through. We agreed to find new spots for our overnight stays, places that didn't have any historical significance or memorial connections. Some savings on rent weren't worth risking our lives or sanity. I've been sleeping in different locations every night since then, never staying anywhere for more than one night at a time. But I still have the video file on my phone, and sometimes I listen to it when I need to remind myself that what happened was real. The voice warning me not to return gets clearer every time I play it back, like whatever spoke to me is becoming more solid and present in our world. 2 weeks later, I heard from another rideshare driver that Carlos had disappeared. His SUV was found parked near that same cemetery, engine running, doors unlocked, but no sign of Carlos anywhere. The police report said it looked like he'd just stepped outside for a moment and planned to come right back, but that was 5 days ago and no one's seen him since. His phone goes straight to voicemail, his rideshare account shows no recent activity, and his family has filed a missing person report. I know I should tell the police about the video and what happened to me in that area, but who would believe a story about dead soldiers conducting eternal memorial services for anyone who dares to sleep near their cemetery? Instead, I'm warning other drivers through online forums and social media groups. Stay away from that riverside location. Don't park near any cemeteries on Memorial Day weekend. And if you hear bugle music when you're alone at night, start driving immediately and don't look back. Some places demand respect, and the price for ignoring that demand might be higher than you're willing to pay. You know how sometimes you think you're being clever, choosing the perfect spot that nobody else would think of? Well, that's exactly what got me into the most disturbing night of my life. I'm about to tell you what happened when I decided to camp near an old Civil War battlefield on Memorial Day weekend, thinking I'd found this peaceful, historic spot. What I experienced that night was pure horror: ghostly soldiers, a van that wouldn't start, and waking up covered in mud with boot prints that shouldn't have been there. Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried, and some places remember things they shouldn't. I'm Mike Robertson, 29 years old, and I live in Sacramento, California. Been doing the van life thing for about 2 years now, converting my old Ford Transit into a pretty decent mobile home. My girlfriend Sarah thinks I'm crazy for spending weekends alone in the wilderness. But hey, sometimes a guy needs his space, you know? She's got her yoga retreats. I've got my van adventures. This particular Memorial Day weekend, I was feeling pretty smart about my destination choice. Figured I'd head out to the Antietam Creek area near Sharpsburg, thinking it'd be this quiet, respectful place to spend the holiday. The drive out there was gorgeous, rolling hills and farmland stretching as far as you could see. I'd done my research, found this little dirt road that led to a clearing about half a mile from the actual battlefield. Seemed perfect, close enough to feel the history, far enough to avoid any crowds or park rangers who might hassle me about overnight camping. The van was running smooth, my supplies were stocked, and I had this whole romantic notion about spending Memorial Day in a place where real American heroes had fought and died. What struck me first when I got there was how incredibly quiet it was. Like, unnaturally quiet. No birds singing, no insects buzzing. Just this heavy silence that seemed to press down on everything. The clearing was maybe 50 yards across, surrounded by old oak trees that looked like they'd been there since before the Civil War. I parked the van facing the tree line, set up my little camp chair outside, and cracked open a beer to watch the sunset. The locals I'd talked to at the gas station had been weird about the whole area, giving me these strange looks when I mentioned where I was headed. One old guy actually told me I should pick somewhere else, son, but I figured he was just being overly protective of his local history. Small town folks can be funny about outsiders, right? Plus, I was being respectful. I wasn't planning to dig around or mess with anything. Just spend a quiet night appreciating the sacrifice of those who came before us. As evening fell, I noticed something odd about the landscape. There were these subtle depressions in the ground, running in straight lines across the field beyond my clearing. They looked almost like old trenches or earthworks, though they were pretty overgrown. The more I stared at them, the more they seemed to form patterns, like formations or battle lines. I grabbed my phone to take some pictures, but the battery was already dead even though I'd charged it that afternoon. The temperature started dropping faster than I expected, and this weird fog began rolling in from the tree line. Not your typical evening mist. This stuff was thick and moved strangely, almost like it was being pushed by invisible hands. I retreated to the van, fired up my little propane heater, and settled in for what I thought would be a peaceful night of reading about Civil War history on my tablet. That's when I heard the first sound that made my blood run cold, the distant, rhythmic thud of marching feet. But it was way too late for any reenactment groups to be out there, and the sound was coming from the direction of the old battlefield. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe some night hikers or park maintenance crew, but deep down I knew something was terribly wrong. The marching sounds grew louder around 10 p.m., and I could swear I heard voices carried on the wind, not modern voices, but something older, more formal. Commands being shouted in that clipped, military way you hear in old war movies. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind playing tricks, but my gut was telling me something different. The fog had gotten so thick I couldn't see more than 10 feet from the van, and the temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees in the past hour. I decided to check my phone again, hoping the battery had somehow recharged itself, but it was completely dead. Same with my tablet, and even my backup power bank. Everything electronic seemed to be drained. That's when I started getting genuinely worried. I've done enough camping to know that's not normal, and the coincidence felt too weird to ignore. The marching sounds were getting closer, more distinct, and I could almost make out the jingle of equipment and harnesses. My first instinct was to start the van and get the hell out of there, but something stopped me. Call it curiosity, call it stupidity, but I had to know what was making those sounds. I grabbed my flashlight, which thankfully still worked, and crept to the back window of the van to peer out into the fog. What I saw made my heart stop. There were shapes moving in the mist, dark silhouettes that looked like men in uniform, carrying what appeared to be rifles. The scary part wasn't just seeing them, it was how they moved. Perfectly synchronized, like a real military unit, but there was something off about their gait. Too stiff, too precise, like they were marching to a drum beat I couldn't hear. I watched them for maybe 5 minutes, these ghostly figures appearing and disappearing in the fog, always maintaining their formation. Part of me wondered if this was some kind of Memorial Day reenactment I hadn't heard about, but it was past 10 p.m. and there were no vehicles, no modern equipment, nothing. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing, telling myself it had to be my imagination or maybe some kind of optical illusion caused by the fog and moonlight. But the sounds were too real, too detailed. I could hear leather creaking, metal clanking, even what sounded like muffled conversations between the figures. The whole scene had this horrifying authenticity to it, like I was watching actual Civil War soldiers going about their business. That's when I made my first big mistake. Instead of starting the van and leaving immediately, I decided to get a closer look. I know, classic horror movie stupidity, right? But in the moment, I was more fascinated than scared. I quietly opened the van side door and stepped out into the cold night air. The fog was so thick it was like walking through cotton, and the marching sounds seemed to be coming from multiple directions now. The disturbing part was how the fog seemed to part around me as I walked, like it was alive and making room for me to pass. I could see maybe 3 feet ahead, just enough to avoid tripping over the uneven ground. The marching sounds were getting louder, more distinct, and I could swear I heard someone calling out orders in what sounded like a southern accent. My flashlight beam seemed weaker than usual, barely penetrating the supernatural mist that surrounded me. I'd walked maybe 20 yards from the van when the marching sounds suddenly stopped. Complete, absolute silence. Not even the sound of wind or my own breathing seemed to register. The fog hung in the air like a living thing, and I could feel eyes on me even though I couldn't see anything. That's when the real horror began. The moment I realized I wasn't alone in that clearing, and whatever was with me wasn't entirely human. The first soldier materialized out of the fog about 10 feet in front of me. He was wearing a tattered Union uniform, complete with kepi hat and musket, but something was fundamentally wrong with him. His face was pale as moonlight, and where his eyes should have been, there were just dark, empty sockets that seemed to pull light into them. He stood perfectly still, shoulders squared, like he was waiting for orders. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even blink as we stared at each other across that impossible distance. Then more of them appeared. One by one, ghostly soldiers emerged from the fog in perfect formation, surrounding me in a semicircle. Some wore Union blue, others Confederate gray, but they all had that same eyeless, otherworldly appearance. Their uniforms were battle-worn and stained with what looked like old blood, and several of them bore obvious wounds, gaping holes in their chests, missing limbs, heads tilted at unnatural angles. The scary thing was how calm they seemed, like this was just another night on patrol. I tried to back away slowly, but every step I took, they matched with a step forward. They weren't aggressive exactly, but they were definitely hurting me, keeping me contained within their formation. One of them, a sergeant by the stripes on his sleeve, raised his hand and pointed directly at me. When he opened his mouth to speak, no sound came out, but I could somehow understand what he was trying to communicate. They wanted me to stay. They wanted me to join them. The thought was absolutely terrifying. That's when I broke and ran. I turned and sprinted back toward the van, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I stumbled through the fog. Behind me, I could hear them following, not running, but marching in perfect formation, their boots hitting the ground in that same synchronized rhythm I'd been hearing all night. The disturbing part was that no matter how fast I ran, they seemed to be keeping pace with me effortlessly. I reached the van and dove through the side door, slamming it shut behind me and hitting the lock button on my key fob. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition, but when I turned it, nothing happened. The engine didn't even try to turn over. I tried again and again, pumping the gas pedal and turning the key until I thought I might break it, but the van was completely dead. Even the dashboard lights wouldn't come on. Through the windows, I could see them approaching the van, still in formation, still marching with that terrifying precision. They arranged themselves in a perfect circle around my vehicle, maybe 10 feet away, and just stood there staring at me with those empty eye sockets. The fog seemed to be getting thicker, pressing against the windows like it was trying to get inside. I grabbed my phone, hoping for some miracle, but it was still dead. I was trapped, surrounded by ghostly soldiers from a war that ended over 150 years ago. The soldiers stood motionless around my van for what felt like hours, just staring with those horrible empty sockets where their eyes should have been. I tried everything I could think of, turning the key, checking the battery connections, even hitting the dashboard like that might somehow bring the engine back to life. Nothing worked. The van was as dead as the men surrounding it, and the fog was getting so thick I could barely see them anymore, just their dark silhouettes against the unnatural mist. Around midnight, they started moving again, not marching this time, but walking slowly around the van in a circle, like they were performing some kind of ritual. I could hear their boots squelching in what sounded like mud, even though the ground had been dry when I arrived. The sound was getting louder, closer, and I realized with growing horror that they were closing in on the van. Their circle was getting smaller with each pass, and I could see their faces more clearly now, pale, gaunt, with dark stains around their mouths that looked suspiciously like blood. I tried the engine one more time, turning the key so hard I thought it might snap off. To my amazement, it actually caught for a second. The engine sputtered and almost turned over before dying again. But that brief moment of hope was enough to make me keep trying. I pumped the gas pedal and turned the key again, and this time the engine roared to life. The headlights flickered on, cutting through the fog and illuminating the ghostly soldiers who were now just a few feet away from the van. The scary part was how they reacted to the light. Instead of retreating or disappearing, they seemed to become more solid, more real. I could see the details of their uniforms, the wounds on their bodies, the expressions of rage and confusion on their faces. They weren't just ghosts anymore. They were becoming something else, something more dangerous. One of them, a Confederate officer with a gaping hole in his chest, reached out and placed his hand on the hood of the van. Where he touched it, the metal began to frost over. I threw the van into drive and floored the gas pedal, not caring if I hit any of them. The van lurched forward, and I felt a horrible thud as we connected with something solid. Through the rearview mirror, I saw one of the soldiers spinning away into the fog, but the others were already reforming their circle, moving faster now, almost gliding across the ground. I spun the wheel and accelerated toward what I hoped was the road, but the fog was so thick I could barely see where I was going. The van bounced and lurched over the uneven ground as I tried to navigate by memory back to the dirt road. Behind me, I could hear them following, not marching anymore, but running, their boots thundering against the earth like a cavalry charge. I caught glimpses of them in my mirrors, dark shapes moving through the fog at impossible speeds, gaining on me despite the van's head start. The disturbing thing was how they seemed to be everywhere at once, appearing and disappearing in the mist like they could teleport. Just when I thought I'd found the road, the engine started sputtering again. The headlights flickered, and I could feel the van losing power. I pressed harder on the gas pedal, but we were slowing down, and the ghostly soldiers were getting closer. I could see them clearly now in the side mirrors, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, running in perfect formation like some nightmare version of a military parade. Their faces were twisted with rage, and their weapons were raised like they were preparing to attack. That's when everything went black, and I felt myself falling into unconsciousness. I woke up the next morning to the sound of birds singing and sunlight streaming through the van's windows. For a moment, I thought the whole thing had been a nightmare. The ghostly soldiers, the fog, the terrifying chase through the darkness. But as I sat up and looked around, I realized something was horribly wrong. The van was parked in the exact same spot where I'd started, facing the tree line, but I distinctly remembered driving away from that clearing in the middle of the night. The first thing I noticed was the mud. I was covered in it, head to toe, like I'd been rolling around in a swamp. My clothes were soaked through and stained with dark earth that smelled like rotting leaves and old blood. But the really disturbing part was that I had no memory of how I'd gotten so dirty. The last thing I remembered was the engine dying and the soldiers closing in, then nothing. just darkness and a vague sense of being pulled down into something cold and wet. I stumbled out of the van on shaky legs and immediately saw the boot prints. They were everywhere, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, covering the ground around the van in perfect military formations. But these weren't normal boot prints. They were deep, unnaturally deep, like they'd been pressed into the earth by something incredibly heavy. And they were old, not fresh prints from the night before, but ancient impressions that looked like they'd been there for decades. The scary part was how the prints seemed to tell a story. I could see where the soldiers had marched around the van, where they'd stood in formation, where they'd apparently dragged something, or someone, away from the vehicle. There was a clear trail leading from the van to the tree line, marked by disturbed earth and what looked suspiciously like claw marks in the dirt. Following that trail with my eyes, I could see where it disappeared into the shadows between the old oak trees. I checked myself for injuries and found scratches on my arms and legs that I didn't remember getting. They were shallow but numerous, like I'd been dragged through thorns or grabbed by many hands. My phone was still dead, but when I tried the van's engine, it started immediately. No hesitation, no problems, like nothing had happened. But the gas gauge showed that I'd used almost a full tank of fuel, even though I'd only driven maybe 50 miles to get there. The most disturbing discovery came when I was loading my gear back into the van. Stuck to the undercarriage, like someone had pressed it there deliberately, was a piece of old fabric. It was blue wool, the kind they used for Union uniforms during the Civil War, and it was stained with something dark and crusty that I didn't want to think about too hard. There was also a tarnished brass button attached to it, with an eagle embossed on the front, the kind of button you'd see in a museum or a historical reenactment. As I drove away from that clearing, I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see ghostly soldiers marching behind me. But the road was empty, just normal countryside and farmland. It wasn't until I got back to Sacramento and did some research that I learned the truth about that place. The battlefield I'd camped near wasn't just any Civil War site. It was the location of a particularly brutal massacre, where hundreds of soldiers from both sides had been killed and buried in unmarked graves. And according to local legend, they still march there every Memorial Day, looking for the living to join their eternal patrol.